Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Benjamin Saltzman. He's an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago, where he co-edits the journal Modern Philology. He is the author of Bonds of Secrecy, Law, Spirituality, and the Literature of Concealment in Early Medieval England, and the co-editor of Thinking of the Medieval, Midcentury Intellectuals, and the Middle Ages. And his new book, available April 6th, is called Turning Away, The Poetics of an Ancient Gesture. Benjamin, it's such a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. And yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
Of course.
Absolutely. And then so in Benjamin's book, he wrote, Gestures of aversion resist investigation, but for their variegated pervasiveness, they also demand an investigation. This book is an attempt to perform one. One reason these gestures are so fraught, ethically, but also in their resistance to interpretation, owes partly to their aesthetic form. By this, I mean the way they can formally communicate not only a given negative affect, like shame or disgust or despair, but also emotional reticence or ambivalence, for instance, or spiritual blindness or atmospheric darkness, or even the okay, I'll get it right. Irrepresentability of emotion itself. In fact, it is this aesthetic of the irrepresentable that gave Timanthes. How do you pronounce his name? Timanthe or
Timanthes, yeah.
Timanthe.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Timanthes painting its fame. Roman rhetoricians such as Cicero and Quintilian celebrated Timanthes' work and upheld it as analogous to the rhetorical technique of silence. Why cover up Agamemnon's face? Because it was the only way the artist could express the emotional extremity of a father's grief. The paintbrush was otherwise inadequate to the task. Okay, so I want to kind of start off with like some of the basics before we get into some of the deeper philosophical stuff. So, I mean, this is, what people are going to probably ask. So most of the time, we take when we read, let's say, either pop philosophy or pop psychology, and not saying that disparagingly, people, we tend to write about the actual emotions themselves, like shame, despair, grief, which you obviously mentioned. But in this particular case, you mostly wrote about the behavioral manifestation, the turning away part, right? The aversion or the averting of them, right? So what made this such an important topic to you?
Yeah. So the book is all about, I mean, it takes as its starting place this gesture, right? Or
Mhm.
this gesture, the gesture of
Yeah.
turning away, a gesture of aversion. And what I found really interesting is that when we study the history of emotions, we tend to start with, say, an emotion like shame or an emotion like grief, and then think about its historical representation, right?
Right.
And when we do that, we'll point to particular instances of, for instance, this gesture and say that's a gesture of grief.
Yeah.
Or we'll, when we're studying shame, find the same gesture and say that's a gesture of shame. And so I thought it would be really, well, I became compelled to start from the gesture itself, as you said, the kind of physical outward manifestation of emotion,
Hmm.
and kind of see where it would take me.
Mm.
And the thing that really captured my interest is just the range of emotions that this gesture can represent in art, in philosophy, in poetry, and the passage that you read was going into some of that range. It's a way that we respond to all sorts of situations, and and when we encounter it, say in a work of art, when we find a figure covering their face, I think the most challenging thing about it, right, is that it's a gesture that actually conceals the expressive content. It
Mm.
conceals the face oftentimes, and therefore makes it very difficult to interpret, to understand what that person that we are encountering, what they might be feeling.
Right.
So that's I guess what I'm interested in. And then we could go into, if you want, into some of the details. The example of Timanthes
Yeah,
is
please. I was actually going to
a
ask you,
little
but
known one. Yeah.
yeah, the Agamemnon. So yeah, can you give
Yeah.
us a little bit of a
Sure.
background? Who was Agamemnon? Why was he
Yeah.
important, etc.?
Yeah. So I start the book with this gesture as it occurs in a painting that had a reputation bigger than itself.
Mm.
And it's a painting by a painter named Timanthes. And the painting doesn't survive. It's merely reputed to have been painted. There is a copy that seems to be very similar that's held in Naples.
Hmm.
Hmm.
It survives from Pompeii. And in this painting, it depicts the scene in which Agamemnon, King Agamemnon, is confronted with having to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia.
Hmm.
Um, and when Timanthes painted this scene, he covers Agamemnon's face. And the reason this painting became so famous was because ancient rhetoricians like Cicero and Quintilian, you named them, right? And a dozen other figures, artists up until the 18th century into the 20th century, for instance, refer back to this scene as, or this painting as, as this kind of impossible situation,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
It's a moment of expression that is so extreme that to represent it by painting Agamemnon's face, by drawing his face or capturing it, would have been completely inadequate to the feeling of a father having to sacrifice or ending up sacrificing his own daughter.
Hmm.
That extreme grief. At the same time, a lot of critics and painters, again in the 18th century or so, they would say, "Oh, he was just a crappy painter, right? Like
Hmm.
any good painter could have
Yeah.
painted the face."
Hmm.
But there's something about the kind of stages of emotional possibility, the range of emotional response to that scene that reaches its pinnacle in Agamemnon and in this gesture, which becomes the object of this book that I've written.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually. The fact that you could take a richly abstract sort of concept like turning away, right, and actually break down all the different meanings that it can have. For example, if you just asked me, what do I think of when I think of turning away? I think of avoidance.
Yeah.
I think of maybe cowardice, not facing something
Mm.
completely. But that's incredibly wrong, right? Like in Agamemnon's, rather Timanthes' depiction, uh, it's grief. It's
Yeah.
essentially it's grief, making an impossible choice. In another situation, it can be maybe not necessarily cowardice or avoidance. It could be maybe it's overwhelming what it is that you're seeing, and turning away for a moment allows time for reflection, right? And it's not necessarily a negative thing that can actually lead towards something positive. It's not
Hmm.
necessarily an act of cowardice. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, you've really just described, I think, what I hope is the big takeaway from the book,
Right.
um, which is that I think we have a tendency, and it corresponds with a central feature of our discourse today.
Mm.
We have a tendency to think of turning away as cowardice or as a moral failure in particular. We
Mhm.
put a lot of weight on the importance of paying attention
Hmm.
and not turning away. And to be perfectly clear, paying attention and collective attention, these are essential um, eh, to preventing and to holding those responsible who, say, commit atrocities or commit crimes,
Hmm.
Mhm.
um, public attention. But we've put too much weight, I think, on the negative aspect of turning away, and as a result, we've ignored those other kind of fundamentally human qualities that are attached to this gesture: grief, reflection, and I think those things, reflection in particular, or even thinking,
Hmm.
um, are just as important as kind of simply paying attention. Um, and in a world where our attention is ever more scattered, I think taking a moment to turn away and to
Yeah.
reflect and to grieve and to sort of regroup and to think
Hmm.
is more important than ever. So part of the story is looking back through time and looking at how this gesture has sort of been represented,
Mhm.
and what does that tell us, and what do we learn from looking at it through the ages?
Mm.
Absolutely. And in regards to actually, let's say modern times, right?
Yeah.
Our consumption of the things that we see on social media. Now, one might argue you have a moral obligation to give your attention every time something may be either catastrophic or an atrocity or something that's not just, let's say, not right happens in the world.
Yeah.
There's almost that feeling like you're compelled to look at these things. However, if one were to do that for every single instance, let's say, that an atrocity or something on the news occurs,
Hmm.
this would be I don't know. It's kind of one, it's a little bit impossible to do that. Two, what are you really contributing with your attention when you're doing that? One could also argue actually turning away, not giving your, I mean, at least not giving your attention to everything or so much is at least healthier. You might say. I don't know. What do you think about
Yeah,
that?
I mean,
Yeah.
I have a couple of different ways, I guess, of thinking of this.
Yeah.
One is that each time, one is to kind of think expansively about what we mean when we turn away, or what the experience of turning away includes.
Right.
And to do so, you might realize that, one moment our attention is focused on one war abroad, and then the next moment our attention is focused on another, and
Hmm.
then another. And each time that we turn our attention from one catastrophe or crisis to the next, um, we are in fact turning away. And
Right.
the frequency with which we encounter these means that we're kind of
Uh,
constantly in a state of turning away. So that's a kind of, I guess that's one way to think about the distended nature of our attention
mhm.
um, in today's kind of media environment, where we have access to a remarkable breadth and speed of information and news.
Hmm.
And then, but then the other ways, I guess I wonder about the risk of something like moral paralysis, right?
Mm.
Right.
Where if the predominant message is don't look away,
Mm.
pay attention to this, the risk is that we end up thinking that merely paying attention, merely directing our eyes to some catastrophe
Hmm.
is enough,
Right.
right? Um, and I think that it feeds our tendency to, let's say, I don't know, doom scroll, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Where we can kind of justify, oh, I'm doing this because I need to be paying attention. I need to have information about what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Sure. Um, but then it can also kind of paralyze us, right? Again, and that speaks to that first situation, which is the one in which our attention is just constantly being turned from one thing to the next. And how do if you don't take a moment to pause and reflect and think, then how do you how does one's moral position succumb to that situation, right?
Mm. And I love that we're touching on the moral aspect of it because, as all of us here, obviously, we're talking about the Agamemnon depiction. So it had me sort of wondering of what the intent of the artist was. So was it essentially to depict him as being a disgraced king? Was it essentially to depict him as a human king? Right. So as we think about it in the context of morals, and we look at the obviously the moral dimension of it, the question is going to come about of like, what does this actually say about the person? Because when we do something like that, right, and you see this in ancient times, especially, I mean, to be fair, even now so too, but especially in the ancient times, right? You see this with like figures like Alexander the Great, Napoleon, etc. Even though Napoleon wasn't ancient, but whatever. Point is, the Genghis Khan, right, was another great example. So the reason why I say this is because these people were inordinately charismatic, and so with that being said, a lot of their moral failings were excused because these were people that were able to stay in the thick of it. So for somebody like an Alexander, just as an example, somebody who I just happen to know a lot about, why doesn't matter. The point is to say with Alexander, so everybody sort of knew this about him, right? So Alexander was somebody who essentially had no fear. If you see the Oliver Stone film on Alexander, which I know people hate, but I love, it's based on the documentary, the biography by Robin Lane Fox. So essentially, it depicts Alexander as this incredibly fearless person, where you have this scene with one of the soldiers where he's essentially like soiling himself, and Alexander kind of looks at him and sort of moves on, giving this great speech, this arousing speech. But the point is to say with Alexander, like all of his moral failings were excused for the simple idea. Maybe this is a little bit simplistic, but I do think that pretty much what I'm saying, the core of it is true, right? But for this idea that he was able to stay in the thick of it, and you could kind of see this as he expands. And the idea was, and oh, there was also this great scene where they're on like the precipice of heading to India, and Alexander's like, "Oh my God, you guys are such cowards! You're turning away from all of this glory." Another example of turning away, and essentially he kind of like shames them, right? As a lot of these soldiers would have shamed each other with this, this other soldier who was soiling himself. And by the way, in that scene, the guy standing behind him was like, he shakes his head like, "Look at how pathetic you are," right? But toward the end, as you're seeing the expansion, right, all of the soldiers are like, "Oh my God, we can't even put up with this anymore." But the point is to say that Alexander had this unbelievable sort of focus and this fixation where no matter what happened, he was able to just keep going, right? So no matter the tragedy, whatever, just didn't make a difference, right? But what my ultimate point is, in our culture, we seem to glorify something like that. So we seem to glorify people who essentially, don't blink, right? There's this concept of like, don't blink, it's kind of as though we're in this like massive staring contest in the world. But what I'm ultimately saying is that when you have somebody like Alexander, it's interesting how all of these moral failings are excused because he's able to face like life, and he's essentially able to face, let's say, difficulties, traumas, etc., unflinchingly, right? So I guess, Ben, my question for you would be, what does that actually kind of say about us as a public, that we kind of glorify that, obviously to the extent and at the expense of all of these other sort of, one could argue, more important morals?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, I think the idea that an unflinching or a sort of steadfast response is the ideal. Um, I mean, I can see that. I mean, I think one thing I want to be careful of is sort of upholding the past or the say antiquity as a kind of golden age of attention or a golden age of morals, let's say. I want to kind of extract some of the complexity and some of the learning that happens over the ages. But it's just as complex back then as it is today, let's say. And I think one of the things that we get in response to your question from the story of Agamemnon and the sacrifice of his daughter is in fact the opposite, right? It's the conflictedness. So he's not eager to sacrifice. The reason he needs to sacrifice his daughter, by the way, is in order to fulfill a prophecy that by doing so will allow the winds to return so that the Greek ships can then sail on to battle the Trojans. And so if there's no wind, they won't be able to. The whole army is in this state of waiting at that moment, and there's a lot of pressure to get going. So that said, he's as a king, he's highly conflicted. He doesn't want to do it. He sends a letter to sort of trick his daughter into coming on the pretense of an arranged marriage to Achilles, and then he interrupts it. He tries to write a secret letter to prevent her to sort of inform her of the truth, and he gets caught, and she has to come. And so there's a kind of wavering on his part.
Hmm.
And I think, again, this is one of the crucial aspects of this gesture. The thing that makes it so interesting is that it's not just a negative gesture. It's in fact more often a gesture that is turning away. It's a gesture of wavering, of
Mm.
conflictedness, right? So we might have this ideal of steadfastness, but the reality is that we, in these moments, maybe we don't present this way, but we are in a state of conflict. And the best example of this comes, I think, from Plato's Republic. There's an anecdote in which Socrates draws on in order to describe the tripartition of the soul, the three parts of the soul. And he divides the soul into the appetite, the logistikon, or the reason, and then the spirit, or the kind of the seat of emotions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
these three parts. And in fact, this kind of tripartition probably will sound familiar to your readers, because it's also sort of evocative of a sort of precursor to
Yeah, Freud.
Freud. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the id, the superego, and the ego.
Yeah.
And so it's in this moment that Socrates is dealing with a problem, and that is that if the soul is one part, then you can't explain those moments where sort of you want to do one thing and then do another, right? Where you're sort of pulled in two directions. And so in order to explain this, he has to divide the soul into multiple parts to explain how those parts kind of pull at one another.
Sure.
Um, and in order to explain how, like to demonstrate how these parts work, he tells the story. And the story is of this guy, Leontius. And Leontius is walking down the road and he sees a pile of corpses next to the executioner, right? So freshly executed corpses. He
Mm.
notices them, and then he uh, sort of feels, it's often translated as disgust is what he feels, but it's more like a sort of hard to the word is literally translated as like hard to handle or hard to bear. And so
Mm-hmm.
he kind of turns away, and then he feels struggle, and he sort of struggles with himself. And it's at that moment that he covers his face, and then he eventually gives in and looks at the sight, and he yells at his own eyes. He curses his own eyes, and he says, "Take your fill of that beautiful sight." Um, and that's the story. What I see there, right, is that in those moments where this figure, Leontius, is covering his face, is turning away, it's not just a negative reaction. It's not just trying not to look. He's already seen the corpses,
Mm-hmm.
right? What he's doing there is, in fact, this kind of conflictedness, this wavering. Should I look? Should I not look? And that's what that gesture kind of represents in that moment.
Mm.
And so again, there, and in that case, I think one of the things that Socrates is doing is he's saying, look, this is an example of a malfunctioning soul.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A soul, a good soul is a soul that is harmonious, where those parts are kind of working in relation to one another, in which the logisticon is keeping the appetites in control, and the spirit is sort of supporting the logisticon in that effort, and it's all working harmoniously.
Mm.
And but look at this guy Leontius, right? Total failure of harmony, right? A total disharmony
Right.
in that situation. So a kind of, yes, maybe that is the ideal, but realistically,
No, of course.
it's that wavering that really makes us human. So
Yeah.
Yeah. And then ideally what Plato said that essentially he should have been able to look and not turn away. Is that essentially the idea
that's
there?
what's
If
totally unclear. Yeah,
yeah.
Mm.
because it's not even clear what action in that moment corresponds to each part of the soul.
Hmm.
It seems like the appetite is the desire to look,
Mm.
um, but then the question is why, why is reason having him not look? Is it kind of, is it grief in that moment? Is it pity,
Mm.
which entails a kind of looking? Is it shame because he's aware of the people around him and he knows that he shouldn't be looking, but he is, or that he shouldn't feel, so uh, uncomfortable about the scene, right? So there's a kind of whole range of complexity around it that gets kind of washed over in order to map it onto the three parts of the soul.
Mm.
Um, and I think the reason why Plato has Socrates telling this story in the moment is to precisely kind of indicate the complexity and the difficulty of actually piecing out
Right.
the soul in this way.
And
So,
so interesting, man, because like we, as a species, we really unfortunately prefer simplicity. So again, I'm just going to use the Alexander example because it's such a
yeah,
good one, right?
yeah,
Because like, so Alexander was a great fit for all of them, the steadfastness, the unwavering, until like, obviously, everybody else hit their limit, right? Now, all of a sudden they're in India and they're like, hey, dude, like, why are we doing this? Like, we have this massive empire, like, we should probably turn back.
Right.
Like, not only is this a waste of time, but this is also a waste of life because many of us are going to most likely die here. But fundamentally, right, this thing that's sort of like was this gift is now a curse, right? Because fundamentally, Alexander had no what's called cognitive flexibility. There's even kind of a hypothesis, which I think is pretty good, that he's fairly autistic and he's very like, what's it called? I guess he's one track. He has a one track mind, right? So with that being said, it's just so super interesting because let's say, had he wavered before, right, they would have lost respect for him and they would have said, oh my God, probably started catastrophizing and started thinking, what does this now mean, right? In these sort of bigger wars, especially, where let's say our empire is kind of at stake here. What's going to happen? Is he not going to be able to deal with it, et cetera, right? So he gave them a confidence there. So interestingly, this is a lot of what we're seeing now with Trump, right? So Trump gives people a sense of confidence because he's very also steadfast, super rigid, right? And it's interesting again because people love in large part. I'm not saying everybody, right? But in large part, they love that rigidity. It's the sense of like, oh, thank God, we can predict that in hard times, this is what we're going to expect from him, or this is what we should expect from him. The problem there is, unfortunately, when there isn't a sort of wavering, when there isn't a turning away, when there isn't a level of appropriateness, when context doesn't seem to matter, what's unfortunately going to happen is this is sort of going to go off the rails, right? And I love again that example of Alexander because once he gets to India, essentially when people are like, okay, we're done, we're ready to kind of turn back, he said, oh, absolutely not. And there's this famous quote with him and Hephaestion, where Hephaestion is his lover slash friend. He essentially asked him, he said, what would you do if you ever conquered the world? And he said, I would turn around and conquer it backwards, right? And for a lot of us, especially in this fucking country, we love that. We love that sense of rigidity, of that not enough, right? Of like everything is sort of predictable and everything kind of makes sense. And these people have these kind of steady characters, right? And they have these like rigid characters. But again, the fundamental aspect of this is, I think, be careful of what you wish for, because what tends to happen is eventually you are going to hit that limit and eventually it's going to become contextually inappropriate. And what's going to happen is that person is going to still keep going while you're like, oh, I don't really want them to. So I guess I would just wonder, what would it have been like, right? Have people, again, because we're all very simple in this respect, but had people kind of looked at it and said, a lot of these responses from Alexander, we're even backtracking. I'm not even talking about India now, but a lot of these responses are inappropriate, right? He wasn't really able to show grief. He certainly didn't show any remorse. And there was nobody that, again, batted an eye because they thought, well, he's super confident, right? They love the charisma. But I wonder what it would have been like had people pretty much tried to, to the extent that they could, had they tried to sort of integrate, right, a sort of a more cohesive identity that does integrate, let's say, turning away, and that does integrate shame and grief and confusion even, right? What would that look like if we were to accept that sort of leader?
yeah. I mean, you said something earlier, the cognitive flexibility. I want to ask you to maybe talk more about that, if I may
Yeah,
flip it
please.
back
No,
on
no.
you from a psychological
Yeah, yeah,
perspective.
yeah.
But I first want to just kind of
Yeah.
draw a connection, which is to the work and the writing of Hannah Arendt.
Sure.
Because, she famously, like her famous critique of totalitarianism, and very controversial, especially at the time. But the critique was that it's a product of, and it emerges from, a state of thoughtlessness or a lack of thinking. And so, I mean, I think that speaks to exactly the kind of scenario that you are describing, extrapolated into our world today. That what is one of the key barriers to the rise of a totalitarian state? Thoughtfulness. But it's really hard to be thoughtful if you are rigid, or say, to kind of come back to that term that you use, that you if you lack cognitive flexibility.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm curious, yeah, what do you think of when you think of cognitive flexibility?
Yep.
What does
So I
that look
could
like?
so
Yeah.
so the first term that comes to mind is literally appropriateness. So whatever's appropriate, expected. And by the way, just to be clear, it doesn't have to necessarily be the norm, just to be, fair.
Mhm.
But it has to be sort of appropriate, like for the actual person, right? So what I mean by that essentially is that, like, let's say we have our own kind of responses, right? And then so whatever it is that, so okay, so two things, right? So number one one, there would have to be sort of differences in context. So meaning that you can't respond the same way in every single context because that's rigidity, right? So what I say is when I use the term appropriate, it's pretty much what's appropriate for you in that specific context. So unfortunately, if you don't meet that first barrier, or let's say, I don't know, I guess you go beyond that. But fundamentally, if you pretty much you're rigid in every single context, that would be considered inappropriate because fundamentally the idea is that there is no propriety at that point. At that point, you're just, kind of monotone, right? So when we think of cognitive flexibility, and, I just, to be clear, because I want to kind of make room for neurodivergence here, because not everybody's going to respond the same. So again, not fair to say like what the norm is. It's more like what's the norm for that person in that specific context. So with that being said, again, appropriateness is super important, but the way that we would think about it is also in terms of thoughtfulness, right? So in this specific context, right, you're going to think about how you would respond, and it would likely be different than at least some other context. Because again, what you see in somebody like Alexander in that sort of one-track mind is it's all the same, right? So his responses are pretty much the same in whatever context. So whether somebody dies, he responds. He responds in a particular way, which is the same again. Whether somebody gets hurt, whether somebody, let's say, has a problem with a particular ethical decision, whatever it is, the response is essentially we have to keep going, no matter what, right? We have to shut this all out and we have to keep going. So when you think of cognitive flexibility, it's essentially the ability to respond to the environment in a thoughtful, nuanced, and again, an appropriate way, in whatever that or to whatever that means to a particular person. So yeah, man, cognitive flexibility is essentially the ability, to kind of what's the word, I guess? The ability to essentially respond in a way that indicates, I guess, well-being, for lack of a better term. Because fundamentally with rigidity, although it's true to some extent that the grandiose narcissism is connected to mental health. The problem with that is in the long run, if you're super rigid, you eventually hit a wall, right? So whereas opposed to cognitive flexibility, you might not have the levels and the highs of grandiose narcissism. The point is to say that overall, you're kind of not only balanced, but you're also grounded, that you have a kind of sense of well-being that the grandiose narcissist would never have.
Interesting. Yeah. I also like that just the terminology that you're using, right? Like flexibility implies a kind of ability to turn, right? It's a very
Yes.
like embodied metaphor word, right? To be flexible and entails sort of turning your spine, turning your body, whereas rigidity is like straight ahead, an inability to turn or bend.
Right.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
go for it.
And I would also add another thing is that with cognitive flexibility, the idea is that you don't differentiate in the binary way, right? So where somebody may look at the Agamemnon painting, right, who has an Alexander bite of, right, they would have said, well, this is weakness, right? So anything opposite of that is strength. So what flexibility is it's not that, right? You're able to see the weakness and strength in almost anything, right? If not everything. No, I don't want to make it super binary. But the point is to say that when we think of flexibility, the idea is that we don't put everything in a neat category because everything is so nuanced. So that person is able to see, let's say the multitude of aspects, maybe two, maybe more, whatever, and they're able to kind of weigh them and to say, okay, this might be a particular weakness here, but this is a particular strength there. Or maybe so there's some degree of weakness here and then some degree of strength here. And you kind of assess it in that way, which again is very complicated and people don't like doing that. So it's easy to look at that painting and to say, well, Agamemnon is weak, right? So therefore we can discount him and find somebody else. So that's pretty much what Alexander feared. Alexander, if you look at what's interesting, if you watch the movie or read the book, you kind of see that a lot of his life was essentially based around sort of barricading himself from being perceived as weak. That was the thing that really mattered to him the most because he was considered to be effeminate. His father frequently criticized him. So the idea was why the rigidity was so important to him was because anything outside of it was considered weakness. And so, yeah, flexibility pretty much accounts for that. And it says, well, no, nothing is that simple. Nothing is either weak or strong. There's sort of elements and degrees of strength and weakness and everything, right? So we can look at an Agamemnon painting and we could say, well, in some sense, that is an indicator of strength because other kings weren't doing that at the time. Maybe he was shunned for it. Maybe he had to put up with a lot of public scorn and rebuke because of it. And he thought to himself, whatever, I can handle this. And, if anybody tries to dethrone me, cool, let him come, So fundamentally what it is, again, is this sort of nuance that a lot of times, if not all of the time, isn't attached to that black and white thinking. So if anything, we could even say in the nutshell that cognitive flexibility is the antithesis of black and white thinking.
Mm. Yeah. So just to turn away from this particular line of
sorry, Alexander. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Alexander. Yeah. So we touched on that idea that we live in a culture where not looking is considered to be a moral failure. And I think what you talk about in the book, it's kind of easy to understand that our culture has a misunderstanding about equating attention with upholding those morals, like as an ethical resource, giving your attention. Um, in the book, I see that you challenge the idea of um, essentially that attention is a kind of moral currency, right? I guess where I want to go with this, because some you mentioned Hannah Arendt earlier, right? Why, if I had to connect, the fact that the attention can be not necessarily equated with upholding morals, how would the story of Hannah Arendt, and I forget the other person's name, but it had to do with racism, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm. Hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that makes Hannah Arendt controversial is her response to the the desegregation of schools in the South. And she had written a piece in 1954, um, basically condemning in response to the famous photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, who is being chased down the street by a group of white students and kind of protesters, an angry mob, really.
Mm,
Um, and so she wrote a piece in response to this and basically condemned the decision for the way that it puts an unfair burden on the children who then the black children who had to go to or were then relocated to white schools. Um, and this produced a very negative response at the time, but has since also continued. And part of the criticism is that she basically misreads Eckford's face, right? That she doesn't, and this is Fred Moten, the poet and performance scholar, uh, who writes about how Hannah Arendt misreads in Eckford's face a kind of a, a situation. And part of that is he attributes it to the sunglasses that she's wearing, so the kind of unreadability of her expression.
mm,
And Arendt reads into that her own sense of how she would feel and assumes that that's how Elizabeth Eckford felt. Um, and what's at the time, Ralph Ellison, the novelist, uh, said in response that Arendt, what she didn't understand was the ideal of sacrifice, or the sense that as a part of Black life, especially in this moment, and Arendt didn't. She didn't recognize that. And one of the kind of remarkable things um, that I realized in writing about this
Hmm.
was that Ellison was deeply influenced by and knowledgeable about ancient and Greek tragedy.
mm,
And so when he says the ideal of sacrifice, there is no way that he's not thinking about Greek tragedy as a genre that deals in the matter of sacrifice.
Hmm.
And it's almost impossible that he would have not been thinking about Iphigenia, because sort of his not his sorry, not his sister, but his like a sister to him
mm,
figure in his life. Her name was Iphigenia,
mm,
right? So the idea that a father's sacrifice would be so ingrained in Black culture really kind of meant a lot to him, and that's something that Hannah Arendt failed to see
Mm.
in that moment. So it's quite powerful. Um, and just the idea of the father's sacrifice as a moment of grief,
Mm.
an impossible situation, a situation in which one is in a state of conflict. Um,
mm.
yeah.
Mm.
So I don't know if
Yeah.
that quite answers your question or gets at
No, it does.
the
No, it
the,
does
the question
absolutely.
about
Sorry, I thought.
moral
No, I was
autonomy.
waiting because I thought you would
Yeah.
have a response.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so in terms
Yeah.
of now going into the actual like morals of it, right? So this is super important. When you think about sort of why people find it sort of difficult, right, to kind of express these parts of themselves, right? So and you kind of go into the Adam and Eve story, which I really want to focus on too, because that's such a great example of it, right? But why is there such a shame around it from what you've seen from your research, right? Why is it that these sort of these gestures that obviously on the surface seem pretty human, why is it that most people find them to be in some ways distasteful?
I think, I mean, I kind of have a hypothesis, and that is that it really emerged in the years after World War II,
Mm,
Huh.
um, where uh, I guess sort of where we became as a society hyper aware of the need to the way in which our attention is a guardrail against atrocity.
mm,
Um, and you can, I mean, there are sort of countless movies. I know you did a thing on Nuremberg a few weeks
mm,
ago,
hmm
right? There's
Yeah.
so many even recent films, the film Lee, for instance, which came out a few years ago, that kind of capture how, on the one hand, how easy it is to just go about your life when there's an atrocity, when there are, millions of people being murdered next door,
right.
Mm.
um, and how dangerous that is.
Mm,
Um, but on the other hand, yeah, I think it's after that moment where we became more and more aware of how crucial our attention is. But what we didn't anticipate is just the degree to which we are now able to see and visualize and encounter and pay attention to atrocities around the world or even more locally um, happening on a daily basis.
right. And can you actually also
Yeah.
touch on how you
Yeah.
reconceptualize the Adam and Eve story?
Yeah. Yeah. So Adam and Eve I end the book talking about Adam and Eve. But I also start the book because it was the first thing that kind of caught my attention and brought my attention to this gesture.
Yep.
Um, and I was studying a text that is in a medieval manuscript written around the year 1000.
Hmm.
And one of the things that makes this manuscript really unique is that it's filled with drawings, pen drawings of, in this case, Adam and Eve, because it accompanies a poetic translation of the book of Genesis,
Mm,
Hmm.
among other things. And so I was looking at these drawings, and what I noticed was that Adam and Eve, in several of them, are shown covering their faces.
hmm
And I thought that's weird, right? That's strange. Normally they're covering their genitals, right? It's
mm,
their suddenly when they fall, they recognize one another's nakedness and what is their first response? It's to cover themselves,
hmm
right?
Yep.
But here they're covering their eyes.
Mm,
And so I just became very curious about that. And that's sort of what set the whole project in motion. Um, and and what I kind of realized is that that's the moment in as a story, right? But also that's the moment in which turning away becomes possible.
mm,
Because what happens is when they fall, when they eat the fruit that's forbidden, their eyes are opened.
mm,
Their eyes are open. That's why they see each other's bodies, right?
right.
But there's also other consequences, right? Suddenly they can see death, right? They can see one another die. They can see struggle. They can see suffering. They can see evil, right? Their eyes are open to not only good, but also evil.
Mm,
And before that, that wasn't even a possibility, right? They were living in
right,
paradise,
right.
and there was no awareness or need to be aware of the sort of evil, the potential of evil in the world.
Hmm.
Um, but now their eyes are opened, and with that, in my reading, comes the possibility of turning away, the need to turn away.
Mm,
In some cases. And so then I started looking at all of these other representations of Adam and Eve in which they're covering their faces, or in the most famous representation where they're sort of actively being turned away, being pushed out of, expelled from paradise.
mm,
Um, and and in those moments, you have the couple, one of them sometimes just sort of covering their face. Maybe it's shame, maybe it's grief, maybe it's this bigger kind of conundrum, right? Is
right, right,
like
right.
I'm facing my eyes are open to all of the kind of horrific things in the world. I need to be able to cover them. Um, and what's remarkable is that this gesture then shows up in all kinds of places. It shows up in I mean, the coolest thing I found were these Works Progress Administration posters from the
Hmm.
1950s, when syphilis was a raging problem. And
Wow.
so there's this one poster with a kind of line drawing of a couple. And it's a mirror image of Adam and Eve being
Mm.
expelled from paradise, covering their faces, and it says, something like syphilis, um,
Mm.
like don't, shame may be fatal, I think is the
Mm.
underlying message, right? So the way in which this couple, the fallen couple, the first couple, gets reproduced in very subtle ways um, into the 20th century, into the 21st century, um, is quite remarkable. And like many of these stories, they're kind of embedded in our consciousness without us necessarily being hyper aware of the connections or where they come from
Right.
or where we even encountered them. Um, so
Yeah,
part of my job is like drawing those connections out.
and it also seems like it's related to intelligence and insight, because one would
Hmm.
wonder at that, right? One would
Yeah.
wonder, okay, so this person, the Adam and Eve story, obviously, right? So there's self-awareness, which we would think. So here's the thing, like that's so weird about, I guess, being human, right? On the one hand, right, we glorify self-awareness, insight, etc., intelligence,
Hmm.
especially, right? But then on the other hand, when there are like these expressions of it, we deem them as weakness. So it's so fascinating because then the question is going to be, what the hell do humans then want?
Yeah.
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 Y- Something I was wondering is it possible that sometimes refusing to look can be actually a deeper form of ethical engagement than sustained spectatorship?
It's a real dilemma,
Yeah.
right? Especially now. I'm thinking about I don't know when this will air, but what has been happening um, most recently in Minneapolis, and the
Right.
need for like the need for recording
Right.
and making those recordings accessible so that any one of us can see with our own eyes
Right.
what happened.
Oh.
Um,
Hmm.
that's essential, but it's also, I mean, very difficult to see, very difficult to watch. And um, and so yeah, I think what I want to do is kind of recognize that dilemma, right?
Right.
Acknowledge that dilemma um that we may, that there are many situations where, as humans, we feel compelled to turn away, and that there is a possibility in which, there are many situations not only where we feel compelled to turn away, but in fact, even the best of us actually turn away.
Hmm.
And I do think that sometimes in those moments when we've turned away, um, we can have an even more profound kind of awareness or engagement with the thing that we turned away from. Like I think of moments where I've turned away from someone and I can't get them out of my head, right? And
Mm.
I can't get
Right.
that response out of my head. And I
Hmm.
think about how I turned away. And it's because I turned away that it is so vivid in my mind, right? And so, I do think that if we are sort of merely absorbed in the immediacy of the footage or the scene or the thing that we're witnessing, um, and never give ourselves the chance to turn away or feel like we can't turn away, then we lose that really meaningful possibility of um, of dwelling, of being sort of forced to dwell with the thing that we turned away from.
Mm.
Wow, that's so
Yeah.
interesting. Oh
Yeah.
man, so because now you could kind of add that to the notion of cognitive flexibility too.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so if we go back to Hume and we look at the his famous saying that reason is the slave to the emotions, right? If you're
Mm.
thinking about it in the context of empathy, let's say, right?
Hmm.
And so now just returning to cognitive flexibility, if let's say, like I said before about propriety, right? So let's say it's appropriate to the person, right? What we essentially mean is it's appropriate to their moral core, right? Their essentially their values. So, but fundamentally, you would need to turn away to figure out whether that is or isn't a value, right? So, if somebody, let's say, feels ashamed of something, disgusted by something, if someone repulsed, whatever, right? The point is to say they need to kind of turn away from it and introspect. Like, should I be turning away, right? What does this mean? What does this say? Why is this good? Or why is this bad? But right, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this isn't so terrible, etc. Maybe this is just sort of a natural reaction that I should try to overcome. But I love that, right? Because fundamentally, the core of cognitive flexibility, again, I would say, I mean, whatever. There's maybe several cores, but like one of the aspects of the core is
You have to be
essentially thought.
flexible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the thoughtfulness, right? It's the idea
Yeah.
is like to think, right? To think
Yeah.
things through.
Yeah.
So I like this idea that you sort of form your morals by turning away, right? Meaning if you're constantly engaged and the world is bombarding you with what it thinks is right and wrong, I mean, fundamentally, you're just like going along with it. But if you're able to kind of retreat, and again, even let's say there's this fundamental empathy that causes some level of disgust, it's important for you to note that, A, and then also figure out why that's there in the first place.
Yeah. 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 And I think, one of the reasons I turn to so much art in this book is because some of the most powerful works of art, um, I think about Goya's The Third of May,
Mm,
which is a painting in which a figure is being executed, a man is being executed, his arms are outstretched, he's dressed in white, and then around him there are other Madrid patriots. And you can see the executioners' bodies, their backs are turned, they're lined up and they're holding their rifles and their backs are turned to the viewer so we can't see them. They're anonymous.
mm,
Um, but around the figure who's being executed are a number of other figures who are covering their faces. They can't look. And it's those, and there hundreds of other examples like this, where like those figures need to be in that painting
mm,
in order to express the the difficulty, the power, the cruelty, the intensity of that scene. Right? If you
mm,
didn't have that, right? If everyone was just, wide-eyed looking at it, at what's happening, I mean, in some ways they'd be no different than the executioners, right? Who are lined up and have their eyes open, presumably to be able to get a good sight. But it's that it's that gesture that makes you realize that I'm looking at a painting that's intense, right?
mm,
That's meaningful. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's just another angle to reinforce what you just said.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
So, and what I also love is that you don't necessarily give or provide, obviously, any prescriptions in the book, right? There's so that's kind of the thing, right? So it's interesting because it's super analytical, right? And it
Yeah.
doesn't sort of offer any advice,
Yeah.
which I really love about it. So why did you forego that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, part of it has to do with I think the way that I write. I
Hmm.
think that if there is um, I mean, I could kind of sit here and we could go back and forth and maybe come up with some strategies, or you may know more about how to advise people to incorporate this into their lives. But there is one thing that I noticed as I was writing the book, which is just that friends and colleagues, once they sort of learned, or if I were talking to them about the project, they would then come to me and say, "Oh, have you seen this? Have you
Hmm.
seen this painting? Have you read this passage? Have you noticed this?" And a lot of those suggestions are, in the book. Some of it
Hmm.
is like core chapters are based on like someone coming to me and saying, "Have you seen this thing?" And so I really want to invite readers. This is a kind of practical advice for reading the book, maybe, is to read it and notice what you notice. We notice what you might happen to notice in the book, and then go out into the world. And I think you'll start to notice this gesture everywhere, right? You'll
Hmm.
see it in movies, you'll see it in TV, you'll see it on the sidewalk as you walk down the street. And so that's, I think, one thing that I might kind of hope for, right? Is that we become more aware of the complexity of this gesture, and therefore to maybe don't resist the tendency to so easily dismiss it as a moral failure.
But then I am curious. So, how
Yeah.
would you respond to somebody who can't sort of disassociate from that notion, where they see their own sort of turning away in moments, obviously, of avoidance, let's say more generally, and they
Yeah.
view it with a lot of shame?
I'd say that that's exactly the point, right?
Mm,
If there is one, right? I'd say the thing you need to be worried about is turning away and not feeling shame or feeling anything in
mm,
response to that. That
Ah,
strikes me as like sheer indifference, right? And
mm.
if you're in a state of sheer indifference, that's a very different state than the one that the act of turning away tends to correspond with. Not always, but that's the difference.
So, I think what you're pretty much saying is if for the
Yeah.
person who is more or less mature, there's an integration of the shame as a part of your character and psyche.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if shame is it could also be grief, right? It could
Mm,
also just be, but it's that awareness. Um, oh yeah, I've turned away. I shouldn't I should ask myself why, right? Why did I turn away? I think that's a really powerful question. And maybe that's the thing to leave with your viewers, right? Is like when you find yourself turning away,
mhm.
um, ask yourself why. Why did I turn away in that
Hmm.
moment? You might have
Yeah.
a very good reason, or you might not, and that's okay too. It's the act of thinking about it and reflecting that's important, I think.
Right. And another great example of cognitive flexibility, right? In some
Absolutely.
contexts, it's appropriate. And then in another context, it doesn't make sense. It should be shameful.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this just as a bit of feedback from having read what we were sent. Honestly, before, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I had this one conception of what does it mean to turn away, like avoidance, cowardice, that sort of thing.
Yep.
After having read it, after having spoken to you as well, no, honestly, I wouldn't even agree with that original notion at all. It can be a very healthy thing, and it could actually really change how a person thinks about that act. Honestly, for some reason, my mind likes to gravitate towards that social media example of just, but honestly, that is so relatable, right? Uh, you might be doing you might be doing a better thing by not necessarily engaging with everything, or at least if something does happen that's entrusted, turning away from it allows you to process it as well. Like instead of just like consuming for the sake of consumption, and you just bring like all these different sorts of points of view to that act, and I don't know. I appreciate that. I like it. I feel like other people will like it as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Alan. So final questions for Ben before we wrap up.
Oh yes, yes, of course. If we would like to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram and have a website, a university one and a personal one. Google me.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
to buy the book, you can buy it anywhere the books are sold, but there's if you buy it through the University of Chicago Press, you can use a discount code, which is I think it's UCP new. So
Oh,
UCP is in University of Chicago Press
Mm,
new, and then I'll get you 30% off. So
nice. And we'll put it on
yeah,
the bottom. We'll put it
that
in
would
the
be
link
great.
section.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate your time and appreciate you listening, and I loved having this conversation. Very grateful.
thank
Absolutely,
you.
Ben. Thank you so much, man. This was such a stellar episode.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Take
All
care.
right, man. Talk to you soon.
Nice. All right, everyone. Again, thank you so much for watching. You can always follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize underscore podcast. Like, subscribe, hit
Hit
the
the bell
bell on
on YouTube.
YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.